Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law. I'm joined by my colleague, Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some news stories that have been coming up this week. So I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we will get started.
Thank you very much, Amelia. My name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and the Managing Director at Digital Law. And indeed, we've got some interesting bits of regulatory enforcement to discuss, as well as some pretty high profile data protection breaches as well. So I'll pass back to you to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. So yes, starting with kind of the high profile data protection breach. So government private information has been leaked. So Parliament's cyber experts have just warned all MPs to better protect their private information following a story released revealing a massive data breach of senior ministers' personal phone numbers and passwords. All available on the dark web for anyone willing to cough up only £6.49, including the private numbers of the UK Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary and the Chancellor. So the Cabinet Office said it's investigating and some of the information was old, but it has been confirmed that the data will contain 26 current phone numbers for the Cabinet, including Miss Truss's. So, I mean, not a great start here. I'll pass over to Peter to kind of unpick some of the key red flags.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is a story that has lots of issues that I think we need to be concerned by. The first is that this is Parliament, and so it's not actually the government, HM government. It sounds like Parliament and the way that it stores and processes data, because this has affected MPs from all sides of the House. So 650 MPs in the British House of Commons in Parliament, and it appears it is data of politicians of all ilk that has been affected. So this isn't as though it's just looking at government ministers and secretaries of state. It's looking at things at the MP level. So it's Parliament and the parliamentary estate, parliamentary data. And it appears that listeners will know that a few months ago we talked about the fact that Parliament had disastrously started to have a TikTok account and then thought better of it when it saw the guidance from other branches of government that said do not touch TikTok because of its data and cyber issues and general lack of compliance and the possibility you'd be sharing data with the Chinese state. Well, in this instance, we're looking at the most sensitive data of our elected politicians. It's commonplace that data, once it's been hacked, is available to be shared for, and it's, I suppose, not a great sign of the worth of politicians' data when you can purchase it for just £6.49 per piece of data. But you can get hold of the data, personal contact information of the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, and other ministers, secretaries of state, as well as opposition politicians as well. So this is being investigated by the Cabinet Office, which is a branch of government, and they are looking into this further. But it doesn't really fill you with confidence. Don't forget that increasingly we rely on government projects to deliver in terms of IT, to deliver services that we rely on, so everything from social security to health services, the NHS, Department of Work and Pensions, etc. And very often these systems are, you're wanting to rely on their integrity. And in this instance, we're talking about the data Parliament's own systems having been compromised. So not a particularly great way for Parliament to cover itself in glory, and it's adding to a general feeling at the moment in Britain that with everything from strikes to energy prices to everything from the trains not working to the courts going on strike, you almost feel with the barristers going on strike, you almost feel that everything's sort of gradually grinding to a halt and not functioning properly. So when you suddenly hear that, even the Prime Minister's personal mobile phone number is available for £6.49 to anyone who wants to use it, it doesn't give you the greatest sense of confidence at the moment.
I think it's worth mentioning as well, Peter, the ICO have actually issued an enforcement notice to the government earlier this year in relation to their use of WhatsApp during the pandemic. So this is again where we've seen the government kind of not really looking at a scenario and suggesting whether the security is quite correct, because most of this data that you're talking about, it's appeared to come from Cove, which is a popular digital contacts book. So if you're a high profile person such as Liz Truss, who is the current UK PM, and you're essentially putting your contact details out there, it's not great. And hopefully the government are going to start learning their lesson here in relation to trusting kind of third-party platforms that maybe aren't all that secure.
Exactly.
Moving on to our next story. So this is looking at Apple. So roller coasters have triggered some new iPhones to make emergency calls. And this is due to the fact that plummeting rides activate the phone's crash detection system. And so this isn't the first time we've looked at Apple in the last few weeks in relation to the security. So this feature was introduced in kind of the newer devices, and it's kind of intended to provide peace of mind and improve over time. But as we can see here, there is a lot of improvements to be made. This is as well coming after the more recent update that was an emergency update due to a security breach from kind of Apple's software side. So I'll pass over to Peter to kind of deconstruct this a little bit more.
Yes, Amelia, this is a fascinating story, and there's several different aspects to it, I think, from our interest and perspective in terms of data and cyber issues. I think the first is the fact that Apple, like many tech firms, is taking data that is generated from our mobile devices and using it for various purposes that very often users are not aware of. So in this instance, if you've got an iPhone and it suddenly experiences incredibly rapid braking, probably, they probably designed it so it goes off after a deceleration of a couple of G. The device presumes that you must have been in an accident and are therefore injured, potentially fatally, and will notify the emergency services. When in this instance, no, it just means that you were actually on a roller coaster. But the implications of that are quite serious. That means that not only are they monitoring your movements in terms of how that device is being operated, and is it moving quickly at a certain constant speed and then suddenly braking, all that information being relayed real time to Apple, who are clearly monitoring it, and then they're thinking, you've been in an accident, therefore we need to notify the emergency services. What do? They're going to provide details of that mobile phone so they could potentially contact, if not you, if you're presumed injured or as a fatality, that others who might find the device would know that they were on their way. Or certainly it would mean that GPS location data, i.e. with your location within 3 to 5 feet of where you are, having then been passed to the emergency services. Bit embarrassing then if suddenly a load of paramedics turn up and think that you're dead, when in fact you're like, no, I was just enjoying a roller coaster. But kind of shows how this data is being used in a way that users didn't really want, need, or ask for, no matter in this instance how well-meaning it might on the face of it seem that Apple is saying we would notify the emergency services on your behalf. I mean, horrible implications, as we were talking about earlier, Amelia, that at the moment when we know that emergency services are overstretched, so the NHS in the UK at the moment is heavily overstretched on the back of COVID and dealing with massive waiting lists, up to 10 million people waiting for surgery. Or is it 6 million people? It's in the millions anyway. The point is that the service is under stress. They do not need to be being called out on potentially erroneous emergency call-outs if the person is actually perfectly all right. I mean, this appears to be a story that's happening in America. It was an article from the Wall Street Journal. So and this is an incident that happened where, for example, it did work correctly recently, and someone in Nebraska, it was a fatal accident, and the emergency services were notified, in which case it's doing its job. But, is this going to end up potentially putting a further burden on emergency services that are already hard pressed?
Thanks, Peter. I think it's worth mentioning as well the fact that it's not just the emergency services that can be contacted here. So when this kind of automatic thing is then kind of activated, if you have an emergency contact that has been selected as part of your device, it will also kind of let them know that you've been in an accident. And so theoretically, they're also looking at data from members of your family or your spouse. So this too is kind of another kind of layer that can be used here.
Exactly, and could give someone reason to think, oh goodness, this person's either seriously injured, I've got to go to hospital, or they may even be dead, when that could be very far from the actual case. And it's just that feeling that somehow, somewhere, Big Brother is always watching you, and you don't necessarily know it. There's a fundamental issue here that I think will have an issue with European data protection rights, because the whole point is that the way that these devices work in Europe is you should be able to turn around and say, I don't want to be tracked in this way. I want you to stop processing my data. And you have to have a way of being able to do this. But if you don't know your data is being processed in this way, you can't then ask them not to do it or request a copy of your data and the information that they've got from having run this exercise. So the whole thing is just an example of this gradual sort of mission creep. Did people necessarily want to ask Apple to do this? Not to our knowledge, but someone somewhere thought it would be a good idea and they've started to do it.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story. So solicitors have been warned to not overplead data protection cases. So a High Court judge has made a veiled warning to solicitors to not overplead on data protection cases and incur massive costs of unnecessary litigation. So in Clearly versus Marston, Mr. Justice Nicklin directed that the claim worth $3,000 should be transferred out of the High Court and allocated to the small claims track to be heard in a county court. Solicitors for the claimant estimated the cost of bringing the case to trial would be almost £47,000, although it indicated they would not oppose any decision to transfer the claim to the county court. So Peter and I, we were discussing this earlier, and there are a few kind of red flags that you could mention, but from kind of a data protection standpoint, I will pass over to Peter to talk this through.
Indeed, I mean this is a sort of story that does not paint the solicitor's profession in a particularly good light, because in this instance, you've got a claim that on the face of it is going to be worth £3,000 and will be firmly within the small claims limit. Small claims meaning that it's a small matter and not worthy of being able to recover your costs from the other side, because it's fairly straightforward. So in the small claims track in the UK, you can't recover your costs from the other side, apart from things like issue fee and a small amount of fixed costs that you generally don't get back from the court. They'll only give you that in quite exceptional circumstances. So in this instance, this law firm thought, well, this is a very complex issue, and data protection is very complex, very technical. We'll probably have about 3 experts to come and bore for Britain in the court to explain what's happened and why the data subject's rights have been affected, and the other side will want to defend it, so there might be a week's worth of litigation. And they estimated their costs at £47,000, which indeed would put you outside of the small claims track. But I think is it proportionate to say, well, our costs are going to be £47,000 on a £3,000 claim? I think that's the bit that's, I think, quite difficult to explain that to other lawyers whose grasp of issues around data protection may not be the strongest, let alone to the person in the street who looks at this and think, is this another headline from the Daily Mail? That's kind of how it reads, really. As I say, it's almost, as I say, the worst of the profession, because it's in effect, it reads like a law firm trying to sort of take an issue from a claimant who's walked through the door and saying, well, yeah, we could prosecute this claim for you. Our costs will be massive. Ka-ching, that's great for us. You're only going to get 3,000, but we're going to get 47,000. And we'll be able to have lots of associates and partners and trainees clocking up hours on this, and this will be great. This will be great, and we can recover all this from the unwitting defendant. I mean, the thing here as well is it's not as though we're actually looking. If the summit issue it's £3,000, and we understand that the issue related to a debt recovery matter where data was incorrectly shared on this defendant. So if it's a debt recovery matter, it could conceivably refer to, say, like a credit card debt or a mortgage debt or a missed repayment, or albeit personal data. Clearly it is. That's why they're saying the summit issue is about 3,000. But by definition, we are not talking about sensitive data. Sensitive data would be data that relates to, say, criminal convictions or medical records or medical history or political affiliation or religious belief. I mean, even information that you might put on a booking form about allergies that mean that you can't eat certain things, that data on the face of it, because it could hint at religious beliefs or medical history and allergies, that potentially is taking you into that sort of sensitive personal data realm. Debt recovery information is not on the face of it. So it's not even as though we're looking at the more serious level of data protection claim, yet these guys were thinking, we're going to go the whole hog here and we're going to make out this is a major egregious breach, when in fact, on the face of it and from this report, it looks like that wouldn't be justified at all. So as a result, the judge has sent this, booted it out from the High Court and put it down into the small claims track, where I'm afraid that those lawyers, their dream of a big recovery day will have died. The problem for them is that the claimant will probably still want to carry on with his litigation, which has now been issued. That's why it's been in front of a High Court judge. But the claimants won't be able to, the claimant solicitors won't be able to actually recover their costs. They've also got to explain their behaviour to their client. Good luck with that one.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story. So this is looking at a duty on social media companies to establish early warning systems to spot and report signs of grooming, in the same way they're required to report illicit financial activities. So this is specifically looking at kind of stopping county lines and drugs and teenagers kind of getting into that kind of trafficking. And so there have been new requirements brought in. So for anyone buying a mobile phone, they have to provide a name, address, and contact details, which kind of aims to tackle gangs' use of temporary burner devices. But here we are looking at kind of putting obligation on social media to make sure that there are systems in place to kind of report these signs. So I will pass over to Peter to kind of look at how this relates to the online safety bill.
Indeed, thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is a very interesting issue, because anyone who works in a highly regulated sector will be familiar with the incredibly rigorous protections that are now in place around transactions involving money, the great green god. So, if there's ever a risk that you can't be sure who a party is, and you as a professional have not confirmed, for example, where the provenance of certain funds might be coming from, where it's going to, you can be absolutely nailed to the wall as an example to others for that. There are numerous regulatory and representative bodies concerned with issues around economic crime. Can you verify that the person you think is your client, have you met them face to face? Have you carried out ID checks? Are there any suspicions of money laundering? If you have got those suspicions of money laundering, you are under an obligation to report it. If you do not then report it, you will yourself have committed a criminal offence. This is really heavy stuff, really heavy obligations. And this article is making the point, well, that's all well and good, but if we're saying that organisations of all ilk are very often required to do this in relation to financial crime, what about crime that is corrupting the young online in terms of potentially having them groomed into joining county lines gangs? Shouldn't we be saying to tech firms, you are under an obligation to be on the lookout for this stuff, and if you have reasonable suspicion to think that what you're looking at could be issues around county lines gangs grooming young people to become part of them, that you have to report that? It's an interesting philosophical question. It's in effect saying that this is no worse than the financial reporting requirements that you have around things like money laundering and suspicious transactions, etc. That surely we should put it on a par. Or are we saying that money is more important than the lives of young users online? That's the real kernel of this, and it's actually asking quite a fundamental question, because we get very wrapped up in freedom of speech, privacy issues, but this is asking the fundamental question in terms of what is more important on our scale of what's important, particularly when you then factor in the fact that, for example, US tech firms hide behind, I think it's Section 230, that allows them to basically say, We host all of these users, but we are not responsible for their content, so not our problem, mate. Now, that might be shifting gradually in the States as some of the horrific things that are done by the various billions of users online become more and more part of public consciousness. But until it does, I think issues like this and the attempts to do something about it, like the draft online harms bill in the UK, will continue to bubble around. And it's a debate that has to be had. And it's no good just screaming freedom of speech, allow people to say what they like, because then they get up with things like this, and people do get groomed, and people get threatened and bullied, and horrible things happening online. And we say, oh, it's perfectly fine. Conversely, what about the journalist who thinks that we won't be able to publish content, won't be able to publish stories because of the way that some of this legislation could be interpreted? It is a discussion that has to be had. And at the moment, we just seem to have camps in trenches throwing stones at each other rather than thinking about, well, actually, where is the middle ground on this? What level of reporting and requirements and responsibility do we think that the big platforms should have? And that is the ongoing debate, the debate of our times.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story. So this is looking at the Russian hackers being blamed for a cyber attack on multiple US airports. So that's including New York's I can't pronounce it. I'm really sorry. LaGuardia and Chicago.
LaGuardia.
LaGuardia and Chicago O'Hare, whose websites have been taken offline. So as well as those two, there were 14 separate incidents on Monday in the US airports. And other airports that also experienced trouble were Des Moines International Airport, Los Angeles International Airport.
Des Moines. Sorry, Des
Thank
Moines.
you.
Sorry, my wife's American. I'm obliged to know this stuff. Sorry.
And Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. So the flights were not impacted by the attack and the websites were eventually restored. But there are some big problems here. If you think about, okay, 14 separate incidents occurred targeting airports in the US on Monday. How many were actually targeted? Because we know that 14 actually kind of happened, but what are we looking at here? And this is critical infrastructure, another kind of country that has been targeted. So I will pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. This is a fascinating and concerning story. So this is a wave of cyber attacks that took place across the United States airports on Monday, the 10th of October. We're recording this on the 11th of October. And this was in response, or it's thought to be in response by Russia to the attack by Ukraine on the bridge linking the Crimea to the mainland in the Black Sea by Ukraine at the weekend, which disabled that bridge. And as a result, there's been bombing attacks in Ukraine, missiles launched at Kyiv, and then wider cyber attacks have been undertaken. There is an island, one of the Danish islands in the North Sea, with 40,000 people on it. They lost their power, and they're thinking, was that linked to potential cyber attacks by Russia? Russia's saying it had nothing to do with us, as usual. I mean, they wouldn't turn around and say, yes, absolutely, it's us, isn't it great? Very often these things are carried out by hacker collectives that can also offer the Russian government the opportunity to apply, to say plausible deniability. It's not us, it's these hackers, and we have no control over them. But it is thought that these things are being carried out by hacker collectives based in Russia. In this instance, 14 different airport websites were taken down, but this didn't actually affect the operations of those airports as far as we know. So casually, you might look at this story and go, well, so what? The airport website went down. Big deal. Well, the problem here is that if they were able to take down the airport websites, does that mean that then information, other information could be compromised? Could other infrastructure be compromised? I mean, one of the risks here is that if the airport website goes down, is that on the same piece of server infrastructure that other aspects of the airport's operations are based? What if the same server that hosts the website also hosts information or the data that allows for luggage to be processed from the bag drop to the airport, to the airline, to the plane? I'm being entirely hypothetical, but the point is that if a website is taken down, that server is then compromised, and then hackers can get from that system to another by dint of it all being on the same compromised server. Furthermore, what information will the hackers have been able to get hold of once they've been on that airport's website? You know, if they've had command and control of that, what data and information will they have been able to get on? You know, did they have full access to be able to act as administrators? Were they able to get into the back end? What have they been able to do? So lots of unanswered questions there. And I can imagine some people might be listening to this and screaming into the moon, saying, "Oh, you've got it wrong. You aren't thinking about this properly. Who would do that in this day and age? It's all in the cloud. You're talking about infrastructure that no longer is built or operated in that way." Well, hold on. I've spoken to a lot of experts, particularly in the States, who've worked with banks, who've worked with state governments and other key bits of infrastructure like power grids and everything. And the scary thing when I speak to them is they say, look, very often with older bits of infrastructure, be it things like airlines, airports, banks, parts of that network very often are run on old systems, old frameworks, old mainframes, sometimes even relying on old magnetic tape that looks like something that came out from a spy film in the 1960s or something. And that is sometimes part of what these networks are, because they've been built and then new bits have been added on, and new bits have been added on, and new bits have been added on. The whole infrastructure actually requires a huge amount of money and resources just to keep it going. But they're terrified of then dumping all of that old infrastructure and adopting something new. I know one infrastructure expert on IT design who is currently part of a multi-billion-dollar project just to rejig the way that pensions are administered for a European EU member state country. And they are terrified of getting it wrong. They've seen banks like TSB get it wrong when they go from an old system to a new system. And of course, you don't want people to suddenly find they can't draw their pension each week. Imagine if that happened. Cost of living crisis at the moment, people are relying on their pensions. Imagine if they get it wrong and suddenly one week a whole generation can't get hold of their pensions and can't pay their energy bills. Those are the sorts of risks we're now looking at. So the point here that I'm trying to get to is that when you've got websites like this being targeted, in effect, the Russians are saying, we've just hit you and taken that down. What else could we take out that will be even more damaging? What damage have we actually caused? When they've given this story, they just said, oh, yes, there's been an attack. They're not necessarily telling us the implications of that attack and what it actually truly means. And the implications are that systems could be massively at risk of being taken down. And that actually that is a real significant vulnerability. And Amelia, as you said, the thing here is that we know the 14 sites that went down. Were there a wider number that were targeted? And these 14 are the ones where clearly they found a vulnerability. The scary thing is, was it the same vulnerability that they've now found? Do they now know how to get into these systems? And could they then therefore take down more crucial bits of infrastructure in terms of being able to take part of the way these airports operate offline? And I know I talked about the example there of just, baggage. If baggage stops at an airport, that means that the flights are grounded. Look at what happened when they first opened Terminal 5 at Heathrow. Luggage didn't work, flights couldn't take off, big problems. It only takes these systems being down for like half an hour and suddenly you've got mountains of luggage that no one can identify. No one knows where it needs to go to. You've got a load of angry passengers who can't take off. The whole thing falls in on itself incredibly quickly. If you did want to, give the US a sucker punch, that is exactly what you do. You would disable some of their big airports. I mean, Chicago, that's a major transitional airport where people fly in, change at Chicago O'Hare, and then fly on to other destinations in the US, as well as people then flying into Chicago from the US and then flying out to other places. You want to knock out airspace, it wouldn't take much to hack into these sort of systems that might seem fairly innocuous and affect the way that all of those flights operate. So massive implications here, and actually quite scary ones. That's also not the final thing. That attack was done in retaliation for something that happened on the Saturday, and then this attack took these airport websites down on Monday. So it didn't take long for someone to pick up the phone and launch this retaliation. We saw what happened. So these things can happen very, very quickly. Plausible deniability, you can then say nothing to do with us. But believe me, security services in the US will know exactly where those attacks came from, and I think they'll probably be fairly worried about it.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story, you've already mentioned Big Brother today, and this kind of takes it to a new level. So a Dutch court has determined that it is against an employee's human rights for an employer to require them to turn on their webcams. And this choice may alter how businesses approach home-based employee policies. So a company in Florida made the decision to employ a telemarketer in the Netherlands. The dispute began when the Florida-based company hired a salesperson, and according to reports, the employer demanded that they activate their webcam. The employee disagreed with that choice and objected to being watched for 9 hours a day. And therefore, he was then labelled for insubordination and work refusal by the company, and hence was fired. And this is all because he just simply did not want to comply with the request to keep his webcam on for 9 hours a day. You can probably see some issues with keeping your webcam on for 9 hours a day. So I will pass over to Peter to unpick this a little bit further.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is a fascinating story when we think about now the huge numbers of people who are engaged in working from home, the numbers of people who now undertake very serious major roles, and they are entirely remote from the office. And their role is seen as being remote. You don't have to go into an office. But then what happens if an employer demands something like this, saying you will leave the webcam on so that we can keep an eye on you all the time? What if the employer says we want to have access to your email inbox? What if the employer doesn't even tell you they have access to your email inbox? What if the employer issues you with a laptop to do your job and it's recording you and you don't know about it, or it's sharing your screen with a server elsewhere and you don't know about it? There's quite significant implications here in terms of surveillance and privacy. I mean, it sounds here as though the employee was asked to do this and he refused, and it still meant that, they said, well, you're fired. There's also an interesting thing here in terms of jurisdiction. This is a company based in Florida in the United States. They may have assumed that, they probably gave this individual either a contract of employment or a contract that said that these services would be undertaken, these sales services in the Netherlands. And they probably, if it wasn't explicitly in that contract, they probably assumed that we're an American company, we're in Florida, the law of Florida will apply, and in Florida we can get away with doing this, perhaps. But in the reality of this, where this individual is in the Netherlands, guess what? You have more employment rights in the Netherlands. This individual has then got at the court in the Netherlands to confirm that actually his human rights would have been affected if he had to have that webcam on all the time. So in this instance, the US-based corporation has found itself on the end of the decision of the court in the Netherlands, and they've been told that you have to pay missed salary, various other fines, etc. Up to it's basically a £50,000 fine plus court fees, back pay, and several other items. So quite a significant amount they now have to pay by order of the court. And they may have initially assumed we don't have to worry about this because we're in America and we'll do what we want. Thank you very much. So it's quite an important point. It is an important point when it comes to, for example, US corporations employing staff remotely in Europe to think about. It's also an important point for all corporations to think about levels of surveillance they have with their staff. If there are practices they're asking their staff to do to facilitate that surveillance, that's one thing, and that's what happens here. But what about if they are using systems without the employee knowing about it in order to undertake surveillance? I mean, I am familiar with one lawyer who did not know that even though they were a partner in a law firm, the managing partner of said firm was regularly looking at their private email inbox, their business work email inbox. And of course, that email inbox wasn't just being used for work purposes, as is often the case. They would also use that email for other personal private communications. And in this instance, they were taking that to arrange things like contact time for children. So very personal things that suddenly this managing partner was able to look at. So the individual in question was appalled and upset to hear that this was happening. And there are laws against this. So in the UK, for example, it is illegal for an employer to look into an employee's email inbox without the employee knowing about it, unless you have a reasonable suspicion of, say, fraud or whatever. And even then, you can only look into that person's email account for a specific time-limited purpose, not indefinitely, as was happening in this instance. But the reason I raise this is because, therefore, it's this issue of where we have people working remotely, what level of surveillance is permissible. And you can either agree mechanisms with the employee, but there are limits on what you can do without the employee knowing about it. And even in this instance, even if you do ask the employee to do something and the employee says, no, I'm not doing that, that's actually pushing it too far, the court here is saying, you're right, you've got a point. You shouldn't have to have, a webcam call on 24/7, or you shouldn't be obliged to have your screen shared 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These are there are limits in terms of what is fair and reasonable in this regard.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our final story of today. So this is looking at the Information Commissioner's Office, so the ICO, their fine of Easy Life Ltd. So they have fined Easy Life in kind of a twofold fine. So initially they were fined just $1,350,000, sorry about that, for using personal information of 145,000 customers to predict their medical conditions and target them with health-related products without their consent. I mean, already there should be some big red flags flying there. Additionally, the company was also fined $130,000 for making quite a lot over 1 million predatory direct marketing calls. So the first part of the fine will fall under GDPR, and then with the second kind of the marketing calls, that falls under PECA. So I will pass over to Peter to kind of demonstrate the difference and why this is so important.
Indeed. So the first part of this, Amelia, is the use of the personal data of individuals for an activity that they didn't want, need, or ask for, namely the fact that, if you purchased something online from this catalogue, and it's one of these sort of catalogues that's, as the name suggests, easy life, make life easier. So you might go in the catalogue and go, I'd like to have this device that allows me to remove the lid from a jar of jam, and I can use this thing and it stops it being difficult to unscrew. They'd then look and go, well, if you're having difficulty with that, we think that you're struggling with XYZ medical condition, and therefore we'll target you with products associated with said medical condition. And several assumptions you can then take from that. One is that people's data, when they're buying this stuff, is being profiled for a reason that they haven't given permission for. And then the second thing is that potentially, and given that this thing is Easy Life potentially marketed to older people, is that you're potentially marketing it to people who don't understand the way that data is collected by retailers, and they wouldn't understand that the reason that someone is then calling up and saying, hello, do you suffer from so-and-so? And if so, would you be interested in buying XYZ product? They will not put two and two together and think this is associated with my purchase of said product from the catalogue, because you're preying on the vulnerability of a section of society that doesn't necessarily get that link between data. And let's face it, there's an awful lot of people that are younger that wouldn't get that link either, but it's particularly the case that they're going to be more vulnerable and potentially ripe for that element of suggestion and exploitation. And that's exactly what the regulator has zeroed in on here. So there is the fine for the fact that that data was being used in a matter that isn't consistent with the requirements of GDPR. GDPR says that if, for example, you sell someone a product, you have to use the data supplied so you can sell the product for that purpose. Being able to then profile people and flog them other things is not part of that purpose. And then the second thing, as you said, Amelia, is privacy and electronic communications regulations. So if you're then carrying out that cold call, or you're sending an email to someone that they didn't ask for, the idea is that under privacy and electronic communications regulations, you have to make it clear that, look, you're receiving this email. If you don't want to receive it, click on subscribe or stop sending it to you. If you're sending the email and you aren't giving people that right, or you aren't acting in a manner that's consistent with the regulations, and you are, for example, undertaking, say, automated calls or quite aggressive predatory sales calls, that will be in breach of the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations, and you'll then be looking at a separate additional fine for that abuse of those means of communication. So hence the two limbs of the fine, add it together, we're looking at 1.3 million.
Thanks, Peter. So that was our final story of today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate again for helping us to produce this webinar, and we will be back next week. So just a reminder that these episodes are available from our YouTube channel, our website, and other podcast channels as well, such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music as well. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.